along. And like the Warren Zevon character in this classic Lawyers, Guns, and Money, our next guest is also a globe-trotting guy who's been in some tight spots in bad places. His name is Bill Birnes, William Birnes. He's, when I say he's prolific, I'm not kidding. He's a New York Times bestselling author, a magazine publisher, a New York literary publishing agent who's written and edited more than 25 books and encyclopedias in the fields of human behavior, true crime, current affairs, history, psychology, business, computing, and the paranormal. But you probably remember him best as the guy with the shades in the UFO Hunters TV series that aired for 3 seasons on the History Channel. His name is Bill Birnes, and he's back with 2 new books. One is a companion piece to the TV series UFO Hunters Book 2, with a look kind of behind the scenes at how the program was put together, things that never made it onto the air. The other is a tell-all biography of a Hollywood legend, Mickey Rooney, and this story will knock your socks off once you hear some of the tragic twists and turns that it took. In a moment, Bill Birnes. Stay with us. More to come here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. I always enjoy having Bill Birnes as my guest because not many people have the depth and breadth of his knowledge, the database in his head about UFOs and related topics. Bill, welcome back. Glad to have you.
Oh, thank you, George. Good to be here.
Let's, before we jump into talking about the first of your 2 new books, I wanted to segue from the first hour we had with John Greenwald, and I don't know if you were able to listen to it, but we talked about the releases, the PR machine that was cranked up by the CIA and the FBI in connection with the, quote, real X-Files. And they both posted stuff on their websites. Look at what we've got, how open and honest we're being and candid. I just want to get your take on that, what's going on there.
Well, when you look at the CIA history of UFOs, and there is one and it's wide open, anybody can find it on the CIA website, what you find out is that they were happily using UFOs as a cover for a lot of what they were doing. And I remember back when we were doing UFO Hunters, our paths would cross with people who'd worked for the CIA. In one case, it was an active, non-official cover agent. And they would say things to us along the lines of, it's a good thing there really are UFOs, because if there were no UFOs, we would have had to have invented them. I mean, it was an open secret among the special access people inside the CIA that we were dealing with UFOs, that they were tracked in our atmosphere. And among the higher echelons of the military, there was also a special access group that was in communication. And in fact, one of the aspects of the CIA, and this is a current story, this is actually, you can find this in the New York Times today, is that the CIA was actually running cover stories to its own employees. So even if you worked for the CIA, you really weren't sure what was true and what was not, because they were disseminating false information within the agency just in case somebody decided to talk. So, and that covered UFOs as well as a whole range of other things. But the CIA was intimately involved with UFOs all the way back, starting right after the passage of the National Security Act and at the beginning of the agency as early as late 1947, early 1948.
You know, the CIA has gotten a lot of mileage out of just what you were saying, but I think some of it undeserved. I mean, years later, after the SR-71 and U-2 spy plane programs are defunct, they issue this report saying, yeah, you remember all those UFOs from the 50s and 60s? That was us, which, of course, is ridiculous. You know, I mean, the number of UFO sightings, the fact that they don't look like flying saucers, these planes we're talking about, that they don't hover over lake beds and over people's homes. They've also, you know, spun it in another direction that might be useful for them, but is patently ridiculous.
Yes, but the other thing the CIA did, and this is what we learned from the Soviets, what the CIA did was they went to a lot of their friends in Hollywood, at the studios, and what they said was, they gave them stories, and these basically movies like This Island Earth, Invaders from Mars, It Came from Outer Space, all the big flying saucer movies and alien creature movies in the early 1950s, right through the 1950s. And they encouraged these producers and these writers to make these movies. And they had their reasoning was brilliant. And it went something like this. Let's just say we're walking down the street in downtown Chicago, we see a UFO. And we start screaming bloody murder, they're here, run for your lives, the Martians are coming. Well, if you've seen 3 or 4 of these movies, somebody saying that is going to be looked at as going to be totally marginalized. Just another person, just like the movie, screaming about UFOs, the body snatchers, they're here. Well, they did that for a very specific reason. By creating a fiction about flying saucers and UFOs and creatures from outer space and invaders from Mars, they basically took the entire issue off the mainstream table and they put it on the fiction table so that everybody thought that you were either a nutcase or it was simply fiction. And that worked so well for UFOs that continues to this day, so that if you want to marginalize something, shunt it off to the motion picture industry, to the television industry, and they'll do the job for you. And that's exactly what the CIA did as early as the early 1950s.
Let me ask you another sort of a contextual question, and then we'll get into the book. Some interesting stuff going on. In addition to the FBI and CIA posting these documents, making it seem like it's new and candid, and they're being upfront about the topic and posting it in multiple kinds of social media, drawing attention to it, we've had some discussion in the presidential campaign. Hillary Clinton talking about being asked and not scoffing at the question, sort of taking on seriously, yeah, I'd like to know, and if I get elected president, I'm going to poke into this stuff and look around, which is the same thing her husband has said. He's been on a couple of talk shows. Obama has made wisecracks about Area 51. There have been, even Marco Rubio got into it. I mean, there is still sort of a laughter factor, but it's also not as much as before. And I just wondered if you have any thoughts on what's going on. Has there been sort of a cultural shift, or am I reading too much into it?
Well, on the one hand, I think the joke is wearing thin. So, I mean, Steve Bassett has made comments about this, that, yeah, when Hillary Clinton was asked by up in New Hampshire to make a comment about UFO, she said, yeah, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Now, she has said that. Bill Clinton, you're right, her husband, Bill Clinton, when he was president, tasked Webster Hubble to try and get to the bottom of the whole UFO question. Jimmy Carter, when he was running for president, made a flat-out campaign statement that he was going to tell the truth to the American people about UFOs, and then supposedly someone walked into the Oval Office, thinks somebody with one of those unlimited access passes like Zbigniew Brzezinski walks into the Oval Office and says, this will destroy your presidency and really put your family in harm's way, so don't do it. And one time at a book signing, I actually tried to ask Jimmy Carter a question about it, and he had this really blank look on his face when he looked up and wouldn't answer. And yet, Jimmy Carter made a UFO sighting report in Georgia. The other person, I think one of the most intriguing statements about a presidential quasi-disclosure was Ronald Reagan. Reagan had 2 UFO sightings, two important UFO sightings, both of which he talked about. One was when he and Nancy Reagan were driving down the Pacific Coast Highway. They were going to a birthday party for Bill Holden, the actor William Holden. We all remember him from the movie Network. And right over PCH, the Pacific Coast Highway, he saw this UFO hovering over the highway, and it shot out over into Santa Monica Bay. And Reagan was so, excited about this that when he got to the party, it was at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, when he got to the party, he basically told everybody, and Lucille Ball, I Love Lucy, she actually mentioned this to her friends, and that's how I found out about it, from Lucille Ball. The other big sighting happened when he was governor, and he was flying from Los Angeles back up to Sacramento, and they spotted a UFO on the way up, and he directed his pilot to chase the UFO. And they chased it all the way out into the Mojave Desert, and the UFO simply shot away. When they landed in Sacramento, the first person that Reagan spoke to was the Sacramento bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. And he says, I saw a UFO, and I'm going to tell Nancy. So, I mean, so he says these two things. He says them in public. He reports his UFO sighting. And then at crucial moments, the meeting with Gorbachev and Reykjavik and making a speech before the UN, he refers to what would happen if the United States, if the world faced a threat from an extraterrestrial entity, and says we'd all get together and national borders wouldn't matter. Now, it's funny because he says that, and then all the way back in 1952, that's kind of exactly what retired General Douglas MacArthur said about UFOs when he told the New York Times that the next major threat the world would face would be from creatures from outer space. So this has been bubbling beneath the surface. And, of course, remember, Harry Truman, we talk about disclosure. Harry Truman, on television, and there is a piece of film about this, actually says these are flying saucers and we know what they are. So as far back as 1950, we actually had official presidential disclosure to the press that flying saucers existed, and that the second half was the government knows what they are. So this has just been a long line of, from 1950 all the way to the present, of chief executives saying that they want to get to the bottom of the whole UFO question. And then there's the whole Kennedy stuff, which you could spend hours talking about that.
Let's talk about your new UFO book, UFO Hunters Book 2. Book 1 was terrific, and the series was terrific. I just thought it was a genuine and open and honest attempt to get some answers on these things. The book is fun. It's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. The series, of course, is gone, but it lives on in a sense. It begat Ancient Aliens, which seems to be unstoppable. Do you miss the show? I mean, it was hard stuff. You can tell from your book. It was hard. All this travel, the places you'd go, get into some hairy situations, but do you miss it?
I do. I mean, it was a wonderful show. One of the things that I liked best about the show was that it took, so you take three shows and you line them up. So the old UFO files from the late 80s into the 90s, UFO Hunters, and then Ancient Aliens. And both Ancient Aliens, which really is UFO files for Ancient Aliens. I mean, it's the same format. Because I've written some of those episodes. And so it is exactly the same format. It is, you state a premise, which was Ancient Aliens built the pyramids, true or false. And then your arguments are why Ancient Aliens built the pyramids, because A, how they're aligned with the stars, how they're aligned with the Earth's grid, why tools back then couldn't have done the cutting they did, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the premise, and it was an argument. There was no real debate on the show. UFO Hunters took an entirely different tack. And that tack was not so much to prove that UFOs were real, but it was to look at the arguments that the skeptics and debunkers raised about specific cases. And where those arguments were valid and legitimate arguments, then those arguments could be sustained. Where the arguments were not, then what you're left with was the stuff that had to be investigated. So the premise was really Sherlock Holmes. In the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, one of the things that Sherlock Holmes tells Dr. Watson, he says that the idea of the elimination of arguments you can refute always leaves you with something you can investigate. And so that's how we approached UFO Hunters. In fact, that's why in the dedication to the book, we dedicated it to Leonard Nimoy, because the show was really based on Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of. And the other one was in this one Star Trek episode, The Gamesters of Triskelion, where Kirk and the crew disappear. They're being transported to a planet, and they suddenly disappear off the sensors. Nobody knows where they are. And the whole bridge crew is screaming, "Where'd they go? Where'd they go?" But what Spock sees is that there's an ion trail leading out into space. And the ion trail is not supposed to be there. It's a trace. It's a physical trace. So Spock takes the whole Enterprise to follow the ion trail while Dr. McCoy is screaming, "You're out of your Vulcan mind. You're out of your Vulcan mind. Why are you going there? Search the planet." Sure enough, he gets to Triskelion where the crew has been abducted. And the premise of that is when there are no other solutions, you follow the one lead you have, even though it looks like a strange lead because you've eliminated everything else. And that was what we did in each UFO Hunter episode. So you look at all the things you can eliminate. So you take something like Maury Island, which was the first episode. It wasn't the first episode we shot. It was the first one that aired. So you take that episode, and you look at every single debunker explanation. And every single explanation worked. There really was no flying donut over the Harold Dahl boat. When Kenneth Arnold went to investigate the Harold Dahl boat, he found no damage on the boat. Why did the B-25 Mitchell bomber go down over Kelso? Was it some strange, weird UFO material? Was it the slag that blew the plane up? No. What it was the material on Maury Island, because there was a smelting plant right across the sound, was iron slag. It was very heavily magnetic material. It was ferrous. What would happen in the B-25 Mitchell bomb bay, which is where the pilots stored the box of material from Maury Island, there was a junction box. So what would happen if you put heavily magnetized material next to a junction box? Well, the junction box wouldn't trip, wouldn't break the circuit. In fact, it overrode the circuit and caused an electrical fire that spread to the wing. And that's exactly what the two technical sergeants who were on board that B-25 who were ordered to jump when the B-25 caught fire. So we figured out there was a logical explanation for what happened to Harold Dahl, why he waited until after the Kenneth Arnold sighting to go public, and what brought the plane down, and what would happen if that material was sitting next to a junction box where we know it was sitting in the bomb bay. So that was a big debunking episode. The best thing about that episode was, why were these two pilots, these two Army CIC pilots, right before the services broke up, why were they dispatched from California up to Washington? That made absolutely no sense until you realized that one of those pilots, Frank Brown, Lieutenant Frank Brown, had investigated
Kenneth Arnold, right?
Yeah, the entire Kenneth Arnold sighting, wrote this glowing report of Kenneth Arnold. And when Kenneth Arnold was asked to investigate the Harold Dahl sighting, because Kenneth Arnold was involved, that's what brought Frank Brown up in the B-25.
I thought it was interesting in the beginning of this new book, the UFO Hunters Book 2, you make the point that, as you're saying, that it was not the purpose of the program to prove that UFOs are real. And you say you'd never want to be pounding your fist on the table because there are physiological things, neurological wiring in humans that make us believe what we believe. Thought that was a really interesting point. We got to go to a break in about a minute, but maybe you can talk about it for that time.
Sure. I mean, human beings are hardwired in some cases to believe what they believe. And so they did neurological studies, CAT scans, of people who were given arguments that comported with their belief system, and certain parts of their brains lit up. Then they were given arguments that actually disputed fundamentally what their belief system told them, and different parts of their brains lit up. So we know that from a neurobiological standpoint, human beings are hardwired. Adults are hardwired to believe certain kinds of things that reinforce their belief systems and to reject things out of hand no matter what the level of logic.
We're talking with Bill Birnes, Mr. UFO Hunter himself. In a moment, we jump back into his book 2, sort of a behind-the-scenes guide to what it was like working on that famous TV show, and a lot more to come still on Coast to Coast. Ray Charles, with a beautiful song, takes us into the break. The song is called Oh Well, one of the earliest, and I'd argue best hits for this classic rock band, Fleetwood Mac, back before the current incarnation, back when Peter Green was sort of the front man for the band. Oh well, good song. We're talking with Bill Birnes in this hour about his new book, UFO Hunters Book 2, sort of the behind-the-scenes look at the TV series and some of the cases that were covered during Season 2. We're going to jump right into a couple of those cases, some you've heard of and maybe some you haven't, right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Bill Birnes, one of the things I enjoyed most about your new book, UFO Hunters Book 2, was sort of the occasional commentary about the nature of the beast, that is, working on a show for a cable network, and the politics of it, and how you never quite know what's going to happen, and how you get on the air, and how you stay on the air. Can you talk about why this show isn't on the air now? Seems like the level of public interest in the topic is rarely, if ever, been higher. Why isn't it still there?
Well, first of all, it costs too much. It costs too much, and the network itself was changing. If you look at the kinds of shows that history is carrying now, they're doing some scripted stuff, scripted series. And they moved a lot of the reality doc shows, UFO Hunters, Ancient Aliens, Ice Road Truckers, porn stars. These are called reality documentaries. They moved them to H2, which is the kind of lower budget part of the network, the lower budget channel. So that was the first thing. There was a change in the way History Channel was doing its programming. That meant that shows that were really expensive. I mean, when we were doing the Nazi UFO episode, for example, in Season 3, we were in Germany, Peenemünde, on the Baltic Sea. Then we went to Poland because of the Nazi bell, that whole segment of that episode. Because of that, that was something like $350,000 for 1 hour of camera time. And that's outrageously expensive. So the show was simply too expensive to put on. But then there was the incident at Delsey. And this was right before we went over to Europe. We were faced with, we had two conflicting stories of Delsey. One was these were flying saucers. And we stayed on the Hickory Apache Reservation. We were talking to the folks on the reservations, the Hickory Apache, and they were telling us about UFOs they'd seen over the site, strange animals climbing up and down the Archuleta Mesa. We spoke to various residents talking about the firefight with the aliens, and so we went through the lore of Delsey. But then we looked at other aspects of Delsey. Why were there cattle mutilations around the mesa? Why was there the strange caravan of black vans at 3 and 4 in the morning leaving the Delsey area heading toward Albuquerque? You know, maybe sometimes 10, 15 cars in a caravan. Why? We talked to tribal police officers who talked about the various strange animals they saw, foxes with heads of rabbits. And I mean, these are anecdotal stories, so nobody had a photograph for us. Then we spoke to Gabe Valdez. And Gabe Valdez told us the story of how when he was still working as a state police officer, a state trooper, he pulled up on a cow alongside the road with a helicopter with strange markings on it. It wasn't a black helicopter. It wasn't an unmarked one. It had strange markings on it. A helicopter hovering over the dead cow. He pulls up, lights and siren are on. The helicopter speeds off. They look at the cow, and it's dead, but it's with calf. So they call a veterinarian. They open up the womb, and sure enough, there is a fetus inside, a bovine fetus, but it has a human head. And Gabe Valdez snapped a series of photographs of that animal. And there was a big discussion at the network. Do we air this photo? I mean, this is like beyond the realm of UFOs. It's almost into kind of like a Fox Mulder X-Files episode at this point. What is this thing? Why was there a human head on a bovine fetus? And why was there a human hand? What was going on with this particular animal? Well, sure enough, we aired it, and that was in March of 2009. In April of 2009, Senators Grassley, Graham, and Mary Landrieu from Louisiana all submit a bill in the Senate making it a crime under Title 18. Title 18 is the federal penal code. Under Title 18 to interbreed humans and animals. Now, I'm not going to say this is one caused the other, but I'm going to say the timing is very, very suspicious. So now we go to Andros Island. It's later in the spring. We're on Andros Island, and we're told, wow, the ratings are so high. You guys, I hope you settle in for like 2 more seasons. Now we go out to Long Island, and we're going to talk about Brookhaven. And there is the strange person, very sartorial gentleman, introduces himself to me off camera, asks if we can sit down and have a chat some morning, lives in the area. Love to talk to you, grab some coffee. We do that. And he tells me, this is your last season, by the way. I'm surprised. Why? Why is that? He says, well, you guys really, on the one hand, when you were at Area 51 last year, and yeah, the Tickaboo Peak segment where you guys climbed up Tickaboo Peak and shot that high-intensity camera on that big hangar at sunrise, you got a lot of people mad. But what really got people mad was when you were sitting in that hotel room over McCarran Airport reading the tail numbers on the Janet airline jets, then running those tail numbers through the FAA database and saying these Janet airline planes belong to the federal government and they were headed out to Area 51. That got a lot of people even more angry. So on the one hand, that was your last strike until you guys aired that crazy Dulce photograph. Don't you know that the toes you stepped on when you aired that photograph were so big, you are in an area, it's almost like you don't want to do this. Back away from this. These people are bigger than you, meaner than you, uglier than you, and it's not about UFOs. So this is the end of you guys, so enjoy your season. And sure enough, within a week, we were told that the ratings had plummeted, and we knew they hadn't because we were beating The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. But your ratings had plummeted, and we're changing the way we do our budgets. The show's too expensive. You guys are going off the air. So episodes later, we're speaking to Nancy Talbot of BLT Research, very famous person. And she tells us, do you understand what you did at Dulce? And we're kind of scratching our heads. Yeah, it was about the aliens and the humans, and they're doing biological research and interbreeding. She said, no. On the one hand, you know that when there's in vitro fertilization, the human ovum cells, they are cultivated in bovine serum. So that's very close to human serum on the one hand. Imagine if you were a major pharmaceutical company working with the United States military, and what you were doing were growing organs, specific organs in cattle. Imagine how big that would be, A, for the military, and B, for medicine in general. Imagine people who can afford this being able to live 150 to 200 years because you could replace an organ the way you replace an alternator in your car. Just imagine that. And that's what you guys stepped into and blew the whistle on it. And now you have these people in the Senate, these senators, saying you can't do this anymore. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry that you guys have just exposed. And so I think that was the death knell for the show.
You know, someone's been carrying out those dissections of cattle and other animals for a long time now. And I think it's more than one outfit doing this stuff. And somebody's been doing it. Humans have been doing it under the umbrella of all the weirdness of cattle mutilations, getting away with it and blaming it, letting the public blame it on aliens or whatever, but doing it for very understandable, down-to-earth, if sneaky reasons. You know, my colleague, Dr. Colin Kelleher, had written about it, that the mutilations may be related to tracking the spread of some bad stuff like mad cow through the food chain. The similarities of human blood and bovine blood have been noted before by other researchers, Linda Howe and such. The similarities between things that went on at the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah and Dulce have been investigated by the same guys who worked on the ranch. So I think you might be onto something there. It's really creepy. It's really creepy.
Well, Colm is absolutely right, because one of the things that one of the problems with mad cow disease is that it's not something that's instant like the flu. I mean, it takes in some cases a decade to fester, and so imagine what would happen. I mean, this is frightening stuff. Imagine what would happen if this stuff began getting into beef in the fast food chains. I mean, you would be infecting an entire population, and you're not going to know this unless you're testing the cattle. But imagine telling the whole world, well, the United States, the Department of Agriculture is buying up all these cows, is buying up all these herds because we want to test for mad cow disease. Imagine freaking out an entire world buying American beef. So you're going to have to do it on the sly. Well, how do you do it on the sly? Well, A, you test selective animals, and you do it in such a way that always blame the alien. You know, it's like the guy on Star Trek, the guy wearing the red suit. You know that's the guy that's going to die in the original series. Always blame it on the aliens. So UFOs, again, very convenient, and it's a great way to test cattle. And where will things like, for example, radiation from grass? Look at all the above-ground nuclear testing we did back in the 1950s in the United States, right in that area, right in those areas, Nevada, Colorado, places like that. What better way to find out how much the ground has absorbed poisonous radiation than testing the cattle that are eating the grass?
You know, it always seemed to me there was something hinky about the show not being on the air anymore. I can understand the expense, but there are other ways you could do the show. I mean, you could change it. You don't have to necessarily, it wouldn't be the same, but you could do a version of the show where you don't have to travel to the scene. You just get talking heads, throw up some standard video. I think the model that Ancient Aliens uses. I mean, they're on the air. I suspect that they're a lot cheaper to produce than you were, but they're also not as in the face. This is stuff that happened a long time ago. It is not as threatening as the kinds of things that you explored.
Ancient Aliens is the safest show about UFOs that I've ever seen. You're not talking about conspiracies. You're talking about everybody's been dead for 7,000 years. And look at there are things that would be great to see on that show, because that show started. The whole premise of Ancient Aliens began. Pat Uskert and I were pushing that show ever since the middle of season 1 on UFO Hunters, saying that nobody's ever done a show about the ancients. There are all these great legends from the local Native American tribes in the Southwest all the way to ancient Sumer. Nobody's ever done it. And so we were pushing Giorgio Tsoukalos and Eric Von Daniken, saying somebody should do a show about Chariots of the Gods. That was that show was on in the 1970s and 80s. Let's do it again. So finally, in the first episode of season 3, the Giant Triangles episode, we got our chance. because Giorgio had this little the Tulamer fighter, and so that was how we began Ancient Aliens, by having our specialty producer, our effects producer, Brick Price, up in the Valley, scale up the little artifact that Giorgio always wore around his neck, the Tulamer fighter. And the plan was, if that thing could glide, don't put an engine on it, don't make any changes to it, just absolutely scale it up exactly the way it is, launch it from a height, see if it flies. If it does, that tells you one thing about what these Mesoamericans would have seen. And we did. And it flew. And that became the basis for Ancient Aliens. And it was a very, very inexpensive show to produce. I mean, UFO Files cost roughly, when you think about moving a crew of, there was a lighting guy, there was a sound person, there was a camera person, and a segment producer. So you're talking about 4 people plus your guest. And 4 people plus a guest, then you've got editing expenses. So figure it would cost about $25,000 an hour, which is really
it's cheap
price for an hour of television. Compare that to $350,000 an hour. I mean, there's a difference. Well, Ancient Aliens cost roughly, maybe in those dollars in that time, 10 years ago, basically $30,000 an hour. The biggest expense was that the production company had to license all of Eric von Daniken's library. And that was really the largest expense of the show, but besides the basic below-the-line production expense.
Well, Giorgio's not here, so I'm not going to go on a rant about Ancient Aliens. I would just say, since you write for the program, though, I think at some point it runs out of material, because now we've got Ancient Aliens pretty much everywhere. They're involved in everything. They built everything.
Right. I mean, and that was, and that's the false premise of the show. I mean, one of the things that you could do is Michael Heiser did it, and this person, Christopher Smith, did it. You could have counter arguments to show that, no, the lines really aren't straight. And yes, if you look at the blocks in Machu Picchu, yes, you could see the marks where the stones were hoisted. If you realize that you could build up dirt mounds on long inclines up to build the pyramids, that's how they move the blocks up there. I mean, you could come up with, this is the whole Sherlock Holmesian approach. You could come up with conventional explanations for all of these megaliths and for all of these artifacts. I mean, one of the big things was, why are these ancient Egyptian villages, why do they look exactly like certain constellations, like the constellation around Cygnus? Well, there's a reason for that. They saw the stars, they built their villages because they believed the deities lived in the stars. That's a conventional explanation for that. It didn't mean that people came down from outer space and populated these villages. So, I mean, there are conventional explanations for all this stuff. When you take it to the extent where they take it, that is, everything was built by Ancient Aliens, what you're basically saying is, how did human beings survive? We were as dumb as the rocks. We lifted up the mountaintops. So,
yeah, I think at some point it does a disservice to the topic. I am not going to harp on the program. I'm sort of glad it's gone as well as it has, but at some point it does a disservice if you say everything was built by aliens. At some point people stop believing any of it.
Right. I mean, what I would love to do, I mean, there are such exciting excavations and discoveries going on now in the Middle East. I mean, for example, right near the Temple Mount, there was a series of excavations, and they uncovered the seal of one of the biblical kings, King Hezekiah. Now, here's the startling thing for me, and I have not seen anybody talk about this.
I'll tell you what, hold that thought, Bill, because we're going to be going to a break here. When we come back on the other side, I'll let you finish the story, and then I'm going to ask you one case that you go into in the book. It's one that you cross paths with me from 2008, Houseboat Bob and this strange thing that slammed into the Colorado River and these men in black characters who showed up. And then we'll shift gears and talk about Mickey Rooney a little bit. James Brown, Night Train, take us into the break on Coast to Coast AM. Well, it's just after midnight here in the Pacific time zone, at least. It's the Midnight Rambler from the Rolling Stones. We're talking with prolific writer Bill Birnes. You know him as the guy from the UFO Hunters, but he's written books on so many other topics, including a new biography, a tell-all about Mickey Rooney. And, man, it does tell it all. We're going to talk about that in this hour, but we're going to finish up our conversation about UFO Hunters Book 2, including a story where Bill Birnes and yours truly cross paths, chasing some really weird stuff out here in the desert. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. So, Bill, right before the break, you were telling me about a potential episode, if you were running the show, that you would dig into. So please continue.
Well, they've been doing a lot of archaeological digging around very old sections of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and they uncovered a bunch of artifacts from during the reign of King Hezekiah, this very famous biblical king. And they found his seal. And on the King Hezekiah's seal, of all things, there is the Ankh symbol, the ancient Egyptian Ankh symbol. What is the ancient Egyptian Ankh symbol doing on the official seal of one of the kings of ancient Israel? That says more to me about the history, the relationship of the various religions, because the Ankh symbol, there was a period of time in ancient Egypt where the Egyptians worshipped the sun god. It was a monotheistic religion in ancient Egypt, and you wonder how much did that influence the Israelites who were building the pyramids in Egypt, and did that carry forward 1,000 years to the biblical era? I mean, that to me is astounding that symbol is on that seal. Yes, I would research that.
Is there any chance that UFO Hunters comes back as maybe a special, or you had any nibbles from other networks? The
answer is yes. I've done at least 2 pilots. One basically was a Men in Black pilot. In fact, the episode that you're talking about in Needles, California, was going to be one of the segments, if we were ever going to do a series to follow up on that with you and with Riverboat Bob and Frank Hottigan and all the people out in Needles. That was one. It was basically an episode saying, it was premised off the UFO Hunters episode, The Silencers. And the premise was, who are the people and what are the agencies that are involved in making sure that certain truths don't get told because they're just too dangerous? So that was one. And then the other one was a series based on ley lines and the Earth's grid. And are there special places like the Bermuda Triangle, like the Dragon Sea off the coast of Japan? Are there areas off the coast of Malibu, for example, are there areas where, because of an alignment of certain forces, of magnetic, electrical forces, certain paranormal events take place? And we were going to visit those places.
Let's talk about the
2 pilots.
Oh, well, I wish you luck,
Yeah. I would love to see them get picked up, but they're floating around. Well, we did another one, too, years ago. It was, believe it or not, it was a real estate show. I had Joel Martin, who I wrote the book Haunting of the Presidents with and Haunting of America, and now we're doing Edison's Last Invention. Thomas Edison, the last thing Thomas Edison did in his life, this is a book coming out later on this spring, the last thing Thomas Edison did in his life was he tried to invent a communications device that would talk to the dead. That was his passion for 10 years. He demonstrated a device based on a motion picture projector in 1920, and that's what he was working on until he died in 1931 in Fort Myers, Florida. And he was in this personal rivalry with Nikola Tesla, because Tesla was also working on the same kind of a device, but from a whole different perspective. Tesla's premise was that since radio waves are eternal, you should be able to pick up the radio. It's modern EVP. You should be able to pick up the radio waves of people who were departed. Whereas Edison was saying that, well, since there's such a thing since electrons tend to be cohesive with each other, the electrons that make up human beings' consciousness would probably stay together after death. If you could lure them across a beam of photons, basically a light beam, it'll interrupt the light beam and you'll get a registration on a meter. So you have these two guys who were bitter personal rivals, each trying to invent a machine to communicate with the dead in the 1920s. And
wow.
so
yeah, I'd read that.
Yeah, I will send you a copy of that when that's done.
Yeah, when that comes out, come on back. One other chapter in the book that I wanted to touch on, as I just hinted, is this episode in Needles from 2008, and I had worked on it for a number of months, and you guys worked on it as well, and I'll just encapsulate it a little bit, and then you can talk about it some more. A strange object comes blazing out of the sky, elongated kind of an object, turquoise, missile-shaped in general, but glowing, slams into the Colorado River, and witnesses see it all along the way. But one witness in particular, Houseboat Bob or Riverboat Bob, who's fishing on the river, and he sees it slam into the brush just off the Colorado River. Within a short period of time, these helicopters come out of the sky. They're flashing lights and beams of light down on the ground on him. And then a giant crane-type helicopter comes, picks this object up, and carts it off into the direction of Area 51. The people in the town, a couple of witnesses, the folks at the radio station there, start seeing strange people in strange craft, cars, vehicles unmarked with a definite military aura, who are checking them out, following them around, seemingly intimidating them. It had kind of a Men in Black kind of a vibe. We had heard about the story, went down many times interviewing witnesses and looking for these Men in Black. And sure enough, one of the trips when we're heading back to Las Vegas from Needles, we see this phalanx of strange vehicles, as described by the witnesses, blazing down the highway. We turn around and chased them and caught up to them. And we're taking video of them, and as we're chasing them, then they pull over and then surrounded us. They get out, flashed a badge, said we're federal agents. They weren't going to say too much about what they were doing, but stay away from us, basically. They warned us to stay away. And then I get a call on the way back to town, not long thereafter, from a friend of mine at a federal agency who said, "What the hell were you doing? Do you know who those guys were?" And I said, "No, but I sure would like to." And then we subsequently found out about it later. I'll let you pick up the story because you guys did do some great digging into that whole various assortment of mysteries.
Well, on the one hand, Riverboat Bob, who was a really gregarious guy, describes this scene, and he was amazed because it didn't just crash. I mean, if you talk to the two main witnesses we spoke to, this guy, Riverboat Bob, but the other guy was Frank Ossigan, who was LAPD. He was an LAPD. He was chief at Los Angeles International Airport, and he was one of the directors of the airport. So this guy knew aircraft. He was not an amateur, and he'd been a cop for like 1,000 years. And what he told us was this thing didn't just come flying and smashing into the earth like a meteor, like War of the Worlds. This thing actually seemed to do a controlled landing. Crash landing, but a controlled landing. And that's what Riverboat Bob also said. And the people in the town of Needles were really intimidated by these guys. I mean, you met up with these guys, and these were rough guys. They were dressed in black. They were they were armed. They flashed a badge at you. They were federal officers. So it wasn't as though these guys were wearing black suits with white shirts and hats. So this wasn't an MIB situation. But when you and I spoke about it, I think what we were talking about was that these guys might have been people that were doing retrieval for nuclear material. And that's what, because this object that came down off the Colorado River was glowing. That's what Riverboat Bob said. He could actually see the purplish, bluish glow. And so if that was glowing, and if that thing was radioactive, then you could imagine that there would be some very heavy-duty retrieval people out there looking to bring this thing back to wherever it belonged. And needles is, if you're firing something over the Mojave test range and you miss the test range, you're going to wind up in needles. So it was something clearly fired from someplace. I keep thinking China Lake, but and that it landed over in needles, and these guys set out to get it back. But the thing was that after all the events took place, the people in Needles began reporting black helicopters hovering over the town on a regular basis. So we announced well in advance, we're going back to Needles, and if we see a black helicopter, a lot of bravado there, if we see a black helicopter, we're going to say, come on down and tell us what you're doing. Well, so we get there, we do a night watch, no black helicopters. So I don't know what's been happening in Needles since, but we did speak to Frank Costigan after that thing, and he said that things seem to have died away after the Men in Black, after these nuclear retrieval guys disappeared.
It is confusing because, I kept pushing it and eventually found out who these guys were, at least the guys on the highway. And this friend of mine who had warned me off of it explained, gave me some leads, and we eventually found this agency I'd never heard of before called OST, Office of Secure Transportation. There had been no news stories about them, only rumors, especially among long-distance truckers who would see these guys in these strange unmarked vehicles traveling at high speeds, a definite military vibe to them, though no uniforms. And so they had sort of been the objects of a lot of speculation and legend, at least on the highways. And then we got to meet them and met the head of the agency, and they allowed us to go to the Nevada test site, which was what it was called at the time, which is where they did training. And OST, these are the roughest of the toughest. They were bad guys not bad guys literally, but tough guys, special forces, law enforcement guys whose job it is to secure and transport nuclear materials, in particular nuclear weapons, to move them from one place to another. And they were ready for business. And then my friend had told me, look, if they had been carrying a nuclear weapon at the time that we chased them down and were filming them, we would have been in some very serious trouble because they don't mess around. Anyway, we ended up getting to do a story or a couple of stories about them, the first that had ever been done. I was very impressed with those guys. But it made me think, Bill, that there might be another agency that was operating tried to look like them. Because, when they've got nuclear weapons, they are traveling fast. They don't stop to do surveillance in a town like Needles. So it just made me wonder if maybe somebody else sort of borrowed their general, look and was doing surveillance and intimidation there in Needles among some of the key witnesses.
Well, let's say that you were out there and your job was to retrieve a crashed UFO, for argument's sake. And you're not going to put a sign up saying UFO retrieval, stay away.
Right.
You're going to put a sign up that's really going to make people think this is someplace I don't want to be. And the best way to do that is nuclear, biological, and chemical. You put up an NBC warning sign, nuclear, biological, chemical, people are going to fear for their lives. A biological agent, there's, sarin gases in the area, there's anthrax in the area. You're going to stay far away. So you're going to build yourself a nice little secure zone to do what you want to do under the cover of a nuclear, biological, hazardous material retrieval. And so, if you have these Office of Secure Transportation guys, you could use them for a variety of purposes that may not really, but they may be investigating as well. I keep thinking that the Kecksburg retrieval in 1965 was something along these very same lines, because a bunch of really rough guys set out in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, They told the state police to get off that site. They closed roads. They drove people away. One radio commentator who was covering the story, he wound up dead on the side of a road. Well, we covered that case as well. And in fact, the ironic part about it is that you mentioned Hillary Clinton, because her campaign director is John Podesta, who worked for the Clinton administration back in the 90s. John Podesta and Leslie Kean were the ones who filed suit against NASA to disclose all the information about Kecksburg. Not that they got anything, but Podesta was a big disclosure guy. So that retrieval in 1965 reminded me a lot of Needles in 2008.
Yeah. You make a great comparison in the book, too. If that section alone is enough to justify people buying this book. I was going to go to Mickey Rooney, but we're going to go to a break in about 3 minutes. So let's stay one more little segment on the UFO Hunters book, too. You mentioned about Roswell, and you make the point in the book, look, people are Roswelled out, and they think that everything has pretty much been said that can be said about Roswell. And the fact is, that's still not true. Even after all this time, there's new stuff that comes out. And you particularly address Annie Jacobson's book. It was about Area 51, which ended up taking this very controversial end of the book take on Roswell that had never been proposed before. Maybe you can address that one.
Sure. I mean, first of all, when you read Annie's book, here's the thing that drove me crazy about that book. Kind of right from the outset, there was a problem with it because Area 51 was not established in 1951.
No.
Area 51, if you talk to people like Peter Merlin, who's done a lot of research about that base and about the research that goes on there, really it was an old artillery range from back in World War II. And then when Lockheed was tasked to build the first U-2 planes and needed long runways, the base really opened for business in 1955-ish. So that was on the one hand. So it was not named after the year it was opened, 1951. So that was a very bald, wrong fact. But why at the end of the book would you include this gratuitous story, totally false, would you include this gratuitous story about Roswell that absolutely, just from a structural editorial perspective, never even belonged in the book in the first place? The story about Roswell that Annie tells, which was given to her as a cover story by another person who worked at the base, or who said he worked at the base.
Oh, he did. I know who he is.
Yeah, I know who he is too. Yeah, and Anthony Bragaglia basically was the one who uncovered his real identity. He said that it was basically the Horton brothers' flying wing and deformed children that were provided by Mengele. Well, first of all, let's get the Mengele thing off the table. Mengele, in 1947, was running for his life in South America, doing genetic experiments on South American children, trying to clone Aryan children. In fact, he bragged about it. So he was nowhere near the United States at that time. If Stalin had gotten his hands on Mengele in 1947, he wouldn't have used him for experiments. He would have killed him. So let's get Mengele out of there right away. The Horton brothers' flying wing. It was wood. It was not metal. It was not some odd memory metal craft. It was a wooden craft. It was not an intercontinental bomber. In fact, the Nazis had no intercontinental bombers. If they'd had intercontinental bombers, believe me, they would have tried to bomb the United States. They tried to bomb the United States toward the end of World War II by launching U-boats with V-2 rocket launchers on the foredecks. One of them wound up on its side at the bottom of Long Island Sound. It's probably still there for all I know. That was called, they launched that fleet under Admiral Birnes in 1944. You could read all about it in the New York Times from late 1944. We launched a counteroffensive against that fleet called Operation Dewdrop. So that was the Germans' attempt to launch bombers against the United States. They were guided missiles. So Jesse Marcel would have recognized a Horton Brothers flying wing, because we had a flying wing all the way back in the 1930s.
Well,
and
I
in
guess
1938, we had the flying wings of the movie Shape of Things to Come.
Yeah, your point being there's a lot of holes in that story. It's just weird. I'd like to have a private conversation with you sometime off the air about how that ended up. I think we could exchange some notes. We're talking with Bill Birnes. In this segment, it was about UFO Hunters Book 2. When we come back, his other new project, The Life and Times of Mickey Rooney. And this is a spellbinding tale, let me tell you. This guy had ups and downs that are unbelievable, even by modern standards. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. That's the Eagles, King of Hollywood, which is fitting considering the direction the show takes in the next segment. We're talking about Hollywood, the biggest star, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood history, sort of the Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt of his day, biggest movie star in the world. And yet, by comparison, Justin Bieber is a saint, Miley Cyrus is like a nun, Lindsay Lohan is practically an AA founder compared to the hijinks of Mickey Rooney, and the tragic tale of his end, the millions and millions of dollars that were squandered, the fight over his body, his remains, is heartbreaking. When we come back, we jump into Bill Birnes' new book about the life and times of Mickey Rooney. Stay with us. Much more to come. You know, comedian Dana Carvey used to do this impression of Mickey Rooney, and it's a line he would use mockingly, quoting Mickey Rooney, talking about when he was the biggest star in the world. And our young listeners on the program now are probably wondering, who is Mickey Rooney? Who was he? I can tell you it's no exaggeration to say that he was the biggest star in the world for a long time. How big was he? Bill, why don't you start it off by trying to give us some context of what kind of an enduring star he was.
Mickey Rooney, well, first of all, Dana Carvey was very funny about that, because Dana Carvey and Mickey Rooney were in a television series back in the, I want to say, late 60s, early 70s, called One of the Boys with Nathan Lane. And one of the things Dana Carvey said was that Mickey Rooney wanted to give him kind of acting coaching, acting lessons. And it really made him bristle, because here was this young guy being coached by this older guy, and he really got mad about it. And so since that time, he was always doing these impressions about Mickey Rooney, saying, "I'm the greatest star in the world." Well, that's what Mickey Rooney was from, I would say, the late 1930s right through the time he was drafted. He was probably MGM's top earner. Mickey Rooney, his life is one of these incredible paradoxes. Mickey Rooney kept MGM alive during the Great Depression, single-handedly, and then with Judy Garland, when they did the backyard musicals together and some of the Andy Hardy movies. All the major studios were having a tough time staying afloat in the 1930s. But for Mickey Rooney, for specifically the Andy Hardy series, these were really inexpensive motion pictures to make. They were basically drawing room comedies, because they were based on a stage play called Skidding. And they were drawing room comedies. And Mickey Rooney was the first major teenage star to create a teenage market for a family comedy. So all the situation comedies you had from the 1950s, from the Donna Reed show and, you know, Ozzie and Harriet and all those shows, straight through to the 1980s and 90s, all of those shows, the reason that format was founded by Mickey Rooney's character, Andy Hardy. And these movies would make 20 and 30 times their initial investment. And what the folks at MGM, Louis Mayer, found out was that you would have young kids, teenagers, basically going to see these shows 3 and 4 times. And so that's what kept the studio alive. Then when Judy Garland came on board, and they were doing movies like Babes in Arms, Babes on Broadway, Words and Music, Strike Up the Band, that created another format, basically the High School Musical. And so shows like Glee, Forever Plaid, Grease, all of those were based on those backyard musicals that Mickey and Judy did together. So he was, from, let's say, 1936 straight through 1942, one of the greatest stars in the world. And in fact, when he was in the Army, he was doing Jeep shows with the producer Josh Logan, right at the front in Belgium and then in France, and then when they crossed into Germany. So when he would do the Jeep shows, the Germans, who were only maybe 100 yards away in the front lines, they would stop shooting because they wanted to hear the Mickey Rooney show on top of the Jeep.
It's not only that he was a big star. I mean, if you were to chart his career, there are some definite high points, but he, and some real low points. But he kept coming back, and this career spanned most of the century of the 20th century. He started it when he was like 2.
Yeah, I mean, he actually started in show business when he was 1.5 years old. It was in burlesque, and burlesque circa 1923 was nothing like the burlesque that we all know from, Ann Corio and people like that. It was raunchy. There were, scantily clad women, but it was basically comics and pratfalls and crazy ethnic jokes and stock characters. There were people like Abbott and Costello and Phil Silvers and W.C. Fields and people like that. And there's lots and lots of dancing. And so Mickey Rooney's mother was a chorus girl. She was on the end of the first line of chorus girls, and they were called ponies, and she was an end pony. And his father, Joe Ewell, started out as a prop man and then became a comic. And so that's how Mickey Rooney was brought up, backstage at burlesque. He literally was born in a trunk in a third-floor walk-up apartment on Willoughby Street in Brooklyn. And he was raised backstage by the folks in the dressing rooms. And at age 1.5, he wanders on stage and begins interacting with one of the comics. And the producer of the show thought that was so great, he hired Mickey. So by the time he's 2.5, he's earning more than his own parents. So he was never raised by his parents. He raised his parents. I mean, it really is a staggering thing. So imagine, kids in China grow up speaking Chinese. Kids in France grow up speaking French. Mickey Rooney grew up speaking burlesque. That's what he learned. His whole creation of his whole neurological network was geared to show business. So for the next 90 years, that is all he did. He had no personality. He had no character. There was nothing in real life that was Mickey Rooney. In fact, like Fight Club, the secret of Mickey Rooney is there was no Mickey Rooney. He was only the characters that he played because he only came alive on camera or on stage or in a Las Vegas nightclub. I mean, he was one of those great performers back in the late 1950s and early 60s who basically dominated Las Vegas along with Shecky Green and the Rat Pack.
Well, he was messed up too. I mean, that's the most powerful parts of this book. I mean, you don't hold a whole lot back, if anything. And you mentioned, of course, his father is not exactly Ward Cleaver, and his mother has during some tough times that he caught her basically prostituting herself to keep food on the table, and it messed him up for good.
Right, that was no Donna Reed. She was having men in their apartment. It was a 2-room apartment. Mickey would hear them fooling around from the other room. He wrote in his own autobiography, "Oh, I forgive you, my dear mother," but then he wouldn't even go to her own funeral. When she died, he had his manager go to the funeral to represent him. I mean, he really disliked his parents. He was a toxic waste. That's the problem with Mickey Rooney. He really was. I mean, when you look at the devastation he caused throughout his life, 8 wives, when you look at that devastation and all the lives he ruined, I mean, you realize that he was just a walking tragedy. His life was one giant fall for 90 years, but the studio system itself enabled this guy. So by the time he hits adolescence, I mean, he gets Lana Turner pregnant, and the studio gets her an abortion. He is running around Hollywood drinking, underage drinking, and yet people are fawning all over him. Henry Ford and Edsel Ford, when he does the movie Young Tom Edison, basically they move all of Tom Edison's laboratory to Port Huron, Michigan, to film the movie. And there is Mickey Rooney being held aloft by Henry Ford on one side, Edsel Ford on the other side. They love the guy. He's with Mrs. Edison, Thomas Edison's widow. So as popular as he was, the dark side of Mickey Rooney was that he was just a psychological bombshell who could go off at any minute.
You mentioned one of the stories in the book is about him meeting, as a kid, meeting Walt Disney, and maybe you point to the idea that maybe Mickey Mouse got his name from Mickey Rooney. Tell that story and the evolution of his name.
Yeah, he tells the story. Actually, it was Walt Disney's wife who changed the name of Mortimer Mouse to Mickey Mouse. But Mickey Rooney, because Mickey Rooney had no psyche. There was nothing there. He would invent history on the spot. And so one of the things he would tell us, he said, oh, yeah, I was walking down when I was doing the Mickey Maguire series. I was walking along the Harry Darmore studios, and there was this guy, and it was Walt Disney, and I sat on his lap, and he asked me, what do you think of this mouse I'm doing? He says, oh, that's a great mouse, Mr. Disney. What are you calling it? And Walt Disney says, well, I'm calling it Mortimer Mouse. And Mickey says, well, that's not a good name for a mouse. And so Walt Disney says, how about if I call it Mickey, named after you? Well, it's a totally false story. Same thing with the story of how Marilyn Monroe got her name from Norma Jean Baker.
Right.
I mean, Mickey said, I gave her the name. I took the singer Vaughn Monroe's last name, and I created the name Marilyn. Well, no, she got her name from her agent, Johnny Hyde, at William Morris. Mickey Rooney had no concept of truth.
Well, he also, there is some truth to this saga over how he got his name. Mickey Rooney wasn't his name. It was a middle step that he made. He adopted the name of his character so he could get around some legal issues. Tell that part of the story.
Well, Mickey Rooney gets a job playing a cartoon character called Mickey Maguire from the Toonerville Trolley series. By the way, that's the first cartoon series to become a live-action series of motion pictures. It's another first in the Mickey Rooney story. But he wasn't making that much money, and so his mother, Nell, they go out on the road during public appearances and doing vaudeville acts and public appearances and opening supermarkets and things like that. And so on the road, she names him Mickey Maguire, and that's how he promotes himself. Well, he had to pay Larry Darmore $500 per appearance. And so Nell said they needed the money. They didn't want to pay Larry Darmore any money as a licensing fee to use the name Mickey Maguire. So they drag him into court. They legally change his name from Joe Yule Jr. to Mickey Maguire. Well, this drives the guy who created that cartoon, the Toonerville folks, that drives him crazy. He says, you're stealing my name. So he sues. Larry Darmore sues. Mickey Maguire is not allowed to keep the name Maguire, but he keeps the name Mickey. So now he gets his first job at Universal doing a silent movie. And so Universal has to figure out what to do to change his name, because it can't be Mickey Yule. So they're coming up with names, and so they come up with the name Looney. And Nell says, no, you don't want Mickey Looney as a name. So finally the publicity guy comes up with, how about we change it to Rooney? And that's how Mickey Rooney got his name, from Universal Pictures.
He made a lot of money. He made fortunes during his lifetime, and he blew fortunes during his lifetime. But he was sort of abused, didn't seem to know what he was doing. He didn't have any management to speak of when he was young. They paid him a lot of money for the times and for a young guy, and he was the breadwinner in the family, but studios kind of abused him along the way.
Well, they did. They first they enabled him. But the big thing was, and this is where we got the idea for the book, when we were doing the story of Dr. Feelgood, about the drugging. This guy, Max Jacobson, introduced methamphetamines into America. Well, in the 1940s, Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland, the studio system, at least at MGM, was really an assembly line. they had to keep these kids working. So you had Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, Deanna Durbin, all these great child stars in the 1940s. How do you keep them working? Well, you dope them up in the daytime with methamphetamines, keep them alive, working, and then at night you knock them out with barbiturates. And so that's what happened to Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland as teenagers. Talk about gateway drugs. That's what these kids were on for years at MGM. Well, that destroyed Mickey's life, and that destroyed Judy's life. She overdosed on pills. That's how she died. And so here is Mickey. As a teenager, he is really messed out. And throughout the rest of his life, he is on drugs. Prescription painkillers, prescription drugs. He's on lithium for bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder, by the way, is a side effect of methamphetamine addiction. JFK had a problem with hypergrandiosity and depression. So that's what really typified Mickey Rooney's life. He was just a walking drug-induced disaster. He had 2 attempts at suicide, a number of nervous breakdowns, and he blew through hundreds of millions of dollars. He told us that he once lost $2 at Santa Anita, spent $3 million trying to get it back.
You had mentioned about how the studio was an enabler, and how it would, and the book details how it would cover up things. It would keep scandals out of the newspapers. It would intimidate gossip columnists. And Mickey Rooney is sort of an example of how that enabled him to continue his roguish ways. I mean, you make the point also in the book, his relationships with women were totally messed up, and how it might have stemmed from that experience, seeing what his mom was doing. It sort of set the stage for his relationships with women the rest of his life, and he went through a bunch of them.
That's right. I mean, he was actually looking for a mother figure throughout his entire life. He found it at the end of his life with Jan Chamberlain, his 8th wife. They stayed married for 35 years. In fact, they were married at the time of his death. But he had no concept of what a marital relationship was, because he had no concept of what parents were. It was simply, it's like he came down from another planet. You know, he's like Starman, right? The James Bridges character. He comes down from another planet and has to learn what human beings do. That, more than anything, typified Mickey's life. He sees Ava Gardner off camera when he's making the movie Babes on Broadway, the sequel to Babes in Arms. And he is awestruck by her beauty. And he starts to woo her, and he marries her. But here's Ava Gardner, this 19-year-old girl from North Carolina. She has no idea what Mickey Rooney is like. She just knows him from the Andy Hardy series. And Mickey Rooney has no idea what being married is, loves her. They have connubial relationships, obviously. But he's off playing golf, going to the track, and then he starts sleeping with underage girls. And Peter Lawford, who was his co-star in The Yank at Eton, he starts running back to Ava Gardner. Peter Lawford also plays a major role in Marilyn Monroe's death, but he starts running back to Ava Gardner, telling her all these sordid tales of Mickey Rooney bringing 15-year-old girls back to their apartment on Wilshire Boulevard. So, I mean, that was the first divorce. And he marries his second wife, B.J. Baker, Betty Jane. He marries her on a 24-hour leave in Alabama, and they have a bunch of children. They get divorced when she sees him having an affair with a 14-year-old Elizabeth Taylor in his dressing room, and he just bounces from woman to woman to woman, never really having a marital relationship, and destroying lives in the process. His wife, Betty Ann Thomason, this poor woman, she's like 20 years younger than Mickey. He marries her. He sets her up with a minder, this person, Milos Milosevic, this Serbian actor who came to the United States with the actor Alan Delon. And Milosevic is wanted by Tito in Yugoslavia. They're going to kill him. He tries to get Barbara Ann to divorce Mickey and marry him so he can stay in the United States. When she refuses, they get into a fight over Mickey's gun that he keeps in his bedroom drawer. And Mickey's in the hospital, by the way, at this point. He's overdosed on pills. Milosevic shoots her, then shoots himself, and it's the first murder in Brentwood. I mean, this is the kind of destruction that Mickey leaves in his wake.
Man, that's a sad story. But there's some other ones. There's some other very sad stories in his life. We're going to get into a few of those, and the end, how it ends for him with his family fighting over every dime, and the terrible condition he lived in. We'll get into that as we continue talking about the life and times of Mickey Rooney with the co-author, Bill Birnes. Stay with us here on Coast to Coast AM. The great Bob Seger and Hollywood Nights, and as the characters in that song, the story of Mickey Rooney has no happy Hollywood ending, and you didn't have to be alive in the 30s or 40s or 50s long ago to know who Mickey Rooney was. That might have been when he peaked and was the best-known star in the world, but even after those years, he continued to work. He was in movies and TV shows and made live appearances right up until he died in 2014. He made tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, and also blew that and more. And he was victimized, too. In his last few years, people he trusted fleeced him, controlled him, most likely abused him to the point where he was almost a prisoner, according to some reports, afraid of almost everything. We're going to get into some of that with my guest, Bill Birnes, who's co-authored this book, The Life and Times of Mickey Rooney. And then a little bit later, we'll open up the phone lines with your questions for my guest. Stay with us. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. You know, Bill, people who are young probably don't remember Mickey Rooney, don't think of him as a great actor or a big star. But in the book, you have some amazing quotes from some of the real, true giants of Hollywood, Spencer Tracy, Laurence Olivier, talking about Mickey Rooney's chops as an actor.
That's right. I mean, he was really well respected by the people he worked with. Spencer Tracy, he was in Boys Town with him, which is a big moneymaker for MGM, very important movie. And Laurence Olivier, they basically thought that he was magic on screen. In fact, one of the great stories of Mickey on screen, this was later in life. Mickey always wanted to be a director, but he never really had the chance to be a director. He was a writer, and he did direct scenes. But in this one particular movie, kind of a B movie, low-budget movie, The Secret Life of Adam and Eve, he noticed that his person he's playing opposite, this actress, she had moved out of her key light. On a movie set, each particular performer is lit, and that's called a key light for that performer. And if you're out of the key light, the camera can't pick you up because you're not lit. So Mickey, while he's crying, and he has to cry on camera, while he's crying, he's moving the actress very gently back into his key light. And the director is like amazed at Mickey's ability to do that, never breaking scene while crying, and the actress never knew she was being moved. I mean, that's how talented this guy was.
I remember seeing Black Stallion. Now, this is after his peak. This is way after his peak. But, man, he was great in that movie.
Not only was he good in that movie, he actually, because we spoke to Carol Ballard, who directed that movie, and he directed that movie for Zoetrope, Francis Ford Coppola's studio. And that film was, Black Stallion was always on the edge of not being made. The weather, I think they shot it in Canada. The weather was terrible. The cast was having a lot of problems, and the young kid who was playing the kid Mickey was mentoring in that movie, he was having a lot of problems too getting into character. Mickey, Carol Ballard told us, literally took over the set. That's how talented this guy was. I mean, I met him, obviously, but I am in awe of this guy because he was one of the most consummate Hollywood, he went beyond entertainer. He was one of the most consummate gurus of Hollywood. He took over that set, and he coached this kid in Black Stallion through some very difficult scenes, and it was really Mickey Rooney who made that motion picture happen. And the nice part about it was, at the time they were filming Black Stallion, Francis was busy filming Apocalypse Now. So the studio that was distributing this movie really laid off the Carol Ballard as director, laid off Black Stallion because they were so worried about Apocalypse Now running over budget. And so Mickey Rooney could do what he wanted with the motion picture, and it turns out to be a real phenomenal classic.
Oh, it's a beautiful movie. If people haven't seen it, you should rent it or get it on Netflix or something. You know, in this movie, he plays an ex-jockey who mentors this young kid, and great things happen. He's been a jockey in a lot of movies, which is, I guess it's a bit of irony because the horses played such a big role in his life.
Right. I mean, he basically Santa Anita was his home away from home. In fact, as a present for the success of the Andy Hardy movies, Louis Mayer put a telephone in Mickey Rooney's dressing room to call his bookie at Santa Anita. But the thing about the jockey was that was one of his first roles. See, he was so short that he could only play a little person, or he could play a jockey because he was only like 5'2". So that was part of the problem with Mickey. But one of the last things he did as playing a jockey role, Rod Serling, in the Twilight Zone episode Last Night of the Jockey, wrote a play for him. And Rod Serling was the modern master of the morality play and the psychodrama. So when you're watching Twilight Zones, what you're really watching is the Renaissance version of a morality play on modern television. That's how wonderful Rod Serling was as a writer. And Serling was also very short. And so he exorcised his demons about being short by writing that particular play for Mickey Rooney. And for one entire episode, there's only one character in that play, in that show, and that's Mickey Rooney going through all the antics. And it's got this O. Henry ending where Mickey winds up wishing that he were tall and he becomes a giant. And that's when the phone call comes from his lawyer saying they want him to be a jockey again.
You know, in the introduction to the book, you have a chunk from an earlier biographer, a guy who'd been assigned or had a deal to write a book about Mickey Rooney, and he details just what a terrible experience it was. That, gosh, the guy was a mess and was barely able to get through it. You said you met Mickey Rooney. Did you face those kinds of challenges that the earlier guy did in writing this book?
He was crazy. This is 2007, 2008. I mean, Mickey was really out of his mind. That's part of the problem as Mickey got older. He was out of his mind when he was younger because he was out of control. But by the time he was older, by the time he was in his 80s and kind of heading north into his 90s, he really was completely out of control. He had no sense of reality. Reality was whatever Mickey you were going to get when he woke up that morning, whether it was the nice Mickey or the crazy Mickey or the evil Mickey. I mean, that's really what you were dealing with. But poor Roger Kahn. Roger Kahn wrote this very important book about baseball called The Boys of Summer. And in fact, when I was teaching English, I'm teaching a course called Sports and Lit. I actually taught Roger Kahn, so it was great to get this forward from him. But he said that you couldn't talk to Mickey. We would go to the track to meet Mickey because that's where he lived, at Santa Anita. And he would have this joke that you'd be talking to him and the trumpeter would play the da 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 da, and Mickey would stand up and salute. That was his national anthem. What Mickey loved to do was go to the stables and talk to the jockeys. And the way he'd bet horses would be the smallest jockeys, that's the horse he would bet because he figured that was the lightest weight the horse could carry, right? Forget the racing form. And he would try and see where the fix was in for certain horses. And the other problem was Mickey was working for the mob, not when he was in his 80s, but when he was younger, when he was in his 50s and 60s, he was actually doing debt collection for the mob because he owed so much money to the guys in Vegas, because he would go to Vegas, he'd make $50,000 a week at a club in Vegas, say the Flamingo or the Sands. and then he'd lose 100,000 at the crap tables. Well, then he'd skip out without paying his bill. So the guys in Vegas were getting really mad about this, and you don't want to make them too mad. So what they did was they cut a deal with Rooney. They said, look, we will give you collections to make, and you can make those collections for us and work off your debt. So he was really in deep with the mob.
You had mentioned in the book, too, about the making of It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, which one of my favorite movies, hilarious comedy, terrific cast. But I was thinking to myself as I'm reading this book, man, the last thing you want to do is make a movie where you're doing a lot of shooting in a base of operations in Las Vegas if Mickey is in your cast.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and then you're working with somebody like Jonathan Winters. Jonathan, we're friends with Karen Kramer, who was Stanley Kramer's widow. Stanley Kramer made It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. And so he tells the story that Jonathan Winters, everybody was staying away from Jonathan Winters on the set because Winters had just gotten out of the mental institution. And the person who was most fearful of Jonathan Winters was Milton Berle, because they thought that Winters would go off on him at any minute. And that's what Winters told producer Stanley Kramer. He said, I don't know if you want me in this movie because I can go off in a second. I just came out of a mental institution. And Kramer says to Jonathan Winters, that's exactly what we want. So everybody was wary about staying away from Jonathan Winters and the pickaxe when they were trying to dig that treasure up in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. But yeah, this was a movie that was really, it was a challenge. That's why Stanley Kramer made it. This is the guy that made the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Judgment at Nuremberg, The Defiant Ones, High Noon. Stanley Kramer was one of the producers who broke the Hollywood blacklist. And so for him to make a comedy was so far out of his wheelhouse, but he did it on a challenge, Karen told us. And what he did was he had every comic, and these were basically Vegas comics, right? These were people, Buddy Hackett, the consummate Las Vegas comic, Milton Berle, straight out of burlesque. And the deal was each one of you do your own shtick. Ethel Merman, I mean, that was how the movie was done. And it really worked out.
Oh, it's a great movie. Let's talk a little bit about the last couple of years of his life. I read this article last year, before I even knew you were working on the book, in the Hollywood Reporter, and it was about the last days of Mickey Rooney. And the picture it painted, this reporter who has to slip money, cash, under the table to members of Mickey Rooney's family just to get the interview. And then during the interview, his wife is kicking Mickey Rooney under the table so hard it leaves a bruise in his leg when he says something inappropriate. The picture being painted is an old, fearful man who's totally under the control and domination of others around him. His money and his life are not his own. It was very grim. And you make reference to some of that. I just want to get your take on it, how accurate those articles in the Hollywood Reporter were.
Well, Scott Feinberg, who was the reporter who wrote that story, we had spoken to him. And Scott was actually very graphic. You could find part of that Scott Feinberg interview. I think it was at Vitello's. I'm not sure what restaurant it was. You could find part of that interview online at YouTube. So you could see how fearful Mickey was. Mickey needed Jan's approval. I mean, it was a relationship that lasted 35 years. Jan helped rescue Mickey when he was, he'd had a nervous breakdown. He collapsed on stage. And Jan helped rescue him, and she really revitalized his career because the two of them often did this two-person show together. So Jan was a good influence on Mickey. In fact, at some point, there's a great UFO story surrounding Jan Chamberlain because her father worked for Skunk Works. But so she really helped revitalize Mickey's career, and it was a very stable relationship. But as Mickey got older, on the one hand, he was suffering from dementia. So I know there's a lot of dispute about that, but you talk to his children, you talk to some of the people around him, he really was suffering from dementia. Not severe, but it was. And he was angry. He was just an angry, angry guy. Imagine that when you are 19 years old, 18 and 19 years old, you are earning 20 and 30 million dollars a year for your studio, and you're only getting paid $250 a week because you're a contract player. It gets you crazy. And then you come back from World War II, and you're decorated. Eisenhower, you win the Bronze Star from General Eisenhower, and you're back from World War II, and you can't get a job. You're in your late 20s, and you're too old. And Mickey fought that from, I would say, 1947 on. And the biggest thing he had in his life was this MGM pension, because he'd earned so much money at MGM, hundreds of millions, that he was really entitled to a pension. Well, when this guy Sam Stiefel, another famous character, talked to Mickey out of his contract at MGM and set up the first independent motion picture company using other people's money. When he did that, Mickey lost his MGM pension. That would have kept him alive throughout his entire life. So here he is. He's in his 80s. Basically, he's just not earning any money. And the money he's earning is going to pay back taxes, going to pay the California Franchise Board, paying the IRS. He's still paying off some of his wives. He just doesn't have any money. And he's really scrabbling. But he is earning money. That's the weird part about this. He's in Sugar Babies, where he's earning something like $80,000, $90,000 a week. And Donald Trump is giving Mickey Rooney investment advice, telling Mickey Rooney, don't invest in this, don't invest in that. Mickey had these crazy ideas for companies: Mickey Rooney Macaroni and Cheese, Mickey Rooney Square Hot Dogs, Mickey Rooney Soft Drinks for Dogs, Mickey Rooney's disposable underwear. This took millions. He was putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into these companies that failed. And so he blew through all of his money. He had no concept of marshaling money. The very famous investment banker, Charles Allen, whose daughter, Terry Allen Kramer, was the producer of Sugar Babies, he actually set Mickey up with a stock fund and said, Mickey, don't touch the stock. Don't touch the capital. Live off the interest. When you can't work anymore, this will keep you solvent. Mickey went in, sold all the stock, and Charles Allen threw his hands up and said, there's nothing you can do for this guy. He's his own worst enemy. So that's why Mickey, in his middle 80s, was dead broke. He had all these trust funds, but he couldn't get to them. Dead broke. And his daughters told us, Kelly and Kerry told us, that Mickey complained to them that he had to glue the bottom of his shoes together because they couldn't afford to buy new shoes.
Well, what do you make of the stories? I mean, I can see it. He would have been a handful under any circumstances and would have tried the patience of anyone who's trying to keep him under control, no matter what his age. What do you make of the stories about rip-offs? Of him dying with almost no money, $18,000 or something to his name, and other members of his family supposedly siphoning off $8 or $9 million.
Well, see, that's part of the mystery. On the one hand, there should exist this trust fund from a couple of the movies Mickey was in of about $500,000 to $700,000, which is yet to be dispersed. So that's one issue that's still lingering. There was a fight, and we spoke to the attorney who was the conservator of the estate. Mickey complained in 2010, 2011 that he was suffering from elder abuse. And there's a question about, is that real or is that false? Depending upon which stepchild, which stepson you speak to, it's real or false. His one stepson, Chris, said it's absolutely untrue, that Mickey was never abused. In fact, Mickey was the one doing the abusing. If you speak to the other stepson, Mickey was being abused. The police were being called to the home in Thousand Oaks because Mickey had bruises on him, but there were never any charges leveled. There was never any arrests.
Bill
There was
Birnes, we're
never
going to
any
take a
formal
break here.
criminal
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we'll pick up the story about the abuse. We'll be opening up the phone lines with your questions or comments about either of Bill Birnes' books that we've discussed tonight. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. The Pretenders take us into the break. Poignant tune there from Blind Faith, an early super group, Can't Find My Way Home. And we've got another poignant tale we've been talking about in this hour, The Life and Times of Mickey Rooney, with Bill Birnes. But as noted, Bill is here tonight to talk about two books that he's written, two new books that are out. The earlier one, UFO Hunters Book 2, which was the subject of the earlier part of the program this evening, and we're going to be opening up the phone lines with your questions for Bill about either of those or comments, whatever. We have one more segment remaining in Coast to Coast. Stick around. Bill, I want to give you a chance to finish up and discussing Mickey's last years there, because as you were noting before the break, at least according to one close member of the family, there was no abuse, there was no stealing of his money. But I seem to recall that even at his memorial service or funeral, there was bickering about who would control the body. There were allegations about missing millions, so there must be some kind of allegations in there that are worth exploring.
Well, there were. I mean, on the one hand, the biological children didn't even know their father had died until they heard it on TMZ. There was a fight over who was going to be in charge of the funeral, because there was no money left for the funeral. So a Hollywood publicity agent named Roger Neal, he got this one Hollywood cemetery to provide a mausoleum for Mickey at no charge. So, I mean, there was that. You had the attorneys for the conservatorship. Mickey claimed that he was being abused. That was his claim. And he testified before the Senate Committee on Aging about elder abuse. He never said he was being physically abused. He said money was being stolen from his accounts, that he was being psychologically abused. But it was only his allegation. So he went to court, and he asked the court to provide him with a conservatorship. In other words, he becomes a ward of the court, and the court appoints an attorney to handle his affairs. That's what happened. They appointed an attorney, and the attorney designated his other stepson, Mark Aber, to be his custodian, his caretaker. And Mickey went to live with Mark. And the attorney said to Mickey's wife, Jan, we interviewed the attorney extensively, he said to Jan, look, here's the way this can go. You now have a choice. You can live with Mark and Mickey, your husband, or you can stay with your other stepson and be separated from Mickey. Your choice, which way do you want to go? So she chose to stay with her stepson, Chris, and they separated, but they never divorced. So Mickey spent his final 2 years living with his stepson and his stepson's wife in their home in the valley. And so basically, but what happened was, when we saw the billing records, the amount of money that was spent on, basically they sold Mickey's house in Thousand Oaks. There was a lot of money that was spent in legal bills. There were huge legal bills. And so easily over $1 million was eaten up in legal fees. Probably perfectly legitimate, but it was a lot of money for a conservatorship. And so as it stands now, how it was divided was that you have the biological children saying that they should get some inheritance from Mickey because Mickey told his children he would take care of them for the rest of their lives. You have his wife, Jan, who was entitled to proceeds from Mickey as his spouse, right? California is a community property state. So anything Mickey earned during the marriage, half of that goes to the community, and that's Jan. And then you have the children that he lived with at the end of his life. So there is money there. Nobody knows where it is and how to get it. But here's the weird thing. So Mickey wrote 3 or so wills toward the end of his life, from 2010 all the way to 2014. the children, the biological children, were really concerned that Mickey's signature on his final will looked very different from his signatures on previous documents. So a friend of mine who's a reporter at the National Enquirer said, you know what, send me the wills, and I'm going to have a handwriting expert see if it's really Mickey's signature. Okay, great. So I did that, and I like handwriting experts because that's how we solved the case of the murder of the Black Dahlia, with a handwriting expert. So the handwriting expert says that was Mickey's signature, but Mickey did not know what he was signing when he signed the final will 3 weeks before he died of congestive heart failure. So now the whole thing is back in court, and we will see what happens.
Wow. We've got the phone lines are pretty much full here with questions and comments about Mickey Rooney, so we're going to get to as many as we can. We have on the wild card line in Los Angeles is Miranda, who says she's the daughter of Carmen Miranda and Cesar Romero and knew Mickey's kids. Hi, Miranda. You're on with Bill Birnes.
Thank you. Fantastic show. It really hits my heart. I'm so surprised to hear about it because I grew up with his children, Tim Rooney and the other one, and Dan Kessel, and they did a TV show with me at KPAL Television in the High Desert, Channel 56, and I was amazed because they were the sweetest, kindest people, so talented, so gifted, and they had Corey Feldman, who was on there also, and it was just like an amazing experience, and his mother, BJ, one of the nicest human beings I've ever met, and in a really dark time in my life, when I was really having a rough time with my own personal life, they were the only people there for me. And I was amazed at what God-loving people they are, and I'm still very close with the one who, I know Tim Rooney died, and he was just the nicest person. And his brother, the other one, Mickey Rooney, still alive, but just the most beautiful people I've ever met, and just pure-hearted, and really honest, really upfront. And you would never believe what kind human beings, very genuine. And I'm still close with one who is a stepbrother, and he's helped
Dan
me.
Kessel?
Yeah, Dan. He's awesome.
Dan Kessel is wonderful. Dan Kessel is really fabulous. We interviewed Dan Kessel a lot. Dan was the person who told us this great story of the band, the Rooney Brothers, who were up and down Sunset Strip back in the 60s, back in the late 60s.
Son. The famous guitar player who trained the Beatles. I mean, these are amazing people. And
right.
Dan Kessel got me through my own journey, which I have a book and a film coming out as The Secret Love Child of Cesar Romero and Carmen Miranda. And previously,
hey, Miranda, you're going to have to send me an email. We'll take a look at your book.
All right. Give me. Oh, you know what? I would love to if you could.
All right. Well, the lady who's handling the calls, G. Lee, will get your information, and you can send us a note. We'll check it out. Thanks for calling. Appreciate it. We're going to go to Joe in the Bronx on the wild card line. Has a question about Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. Hi, Joe. Joe in the Bronx, are you there? One more time. We'll try Joe in the Bronx on the wild card 2 line. Hey, Joe, how you doing?
Okay. I'd like to ask your guest, Bill Birnes, was there anything between Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland, and if so, can you elaborate on that?
Good question.
The answer is yes. Mickey said that Judy was the sister he never had. That was Mickey's statement. But when you talk to one of the mysteries of Mickey Rooney was that he had a mistress who shall go unnamed for 60 years. We call her Mrs. Smith in the book. And she would tell the story that when Mickey and Judy would get together kind of later in life, they would their children would all be at Judy Garland's house in Malibu, and Mickey and Judy would go upstairs to the bedroom, and they'd come down all disheveled. So they called them, quote-unquote, sex buddies, friends, but they didn't mince any words about having sex together.
But as you note in the book, Bill, I mean, the bond between them was beyond that. It was something pretty special.
Oh, God. Yeah. I mean, when Judy died, Mickey said that he threw himself on the ground and was pounding the earth and said, Judy, Judy, why did you do this? And then years later, he said, you had the right idea. I should have done it myself.
We have Michael in Long Island on the wild card line number 3 who has a question about the drugs that were given. Is he gone? He's gone. All right, we're going to try Dave in Chicago. Hi, Dave. You're on with Bill Birnes.
George, hello, Bill.
Howdy.
Well, you got L.A., New York, Chicago. You hit the trifecta there.
There you go.
So you know everybody's listening to you, George and Bill, tonight. I wanted to just say I saw Mickey Rooney live in, I believe it was 1980, 1981 Sugar Babies tour in Chicago at the Erie Crown Theater. Was that the years that was going on?
Yeah. Mickey Mickey toured with the show, yes.
Ann Miller, wasn't it Ann Miller?
Fabulous.
And I'm a musician by trade, so I kind of observe things maybe a little differently than everybody. And I noticed that he was very in charge of every aspect of the production. Like you could tell, he was like a master of entertainment and production and, the whole thing. He just kind of steered the whole event, and it was fabulous and very captivating. I was just wondering, was he doing drugs then? Because he seemed pretty wired.
Oh, he was doing drugs his entire life. I mean, he was on lithium for his entire life for bipolar disorder. Lithium kind of mellows out your mood, but one of the things that Mickey was also on was incredible amounts of painkillers.
Was he on amphetamines or something? I think Dave is suggesting he seemed kind of wired.
Well, he was wired. He was on. He wasn't on methamphetamines per se, but he was on uppers, not meth, but he was on uppers that were they were prescription drugs. Yes.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate the call. We got a first-time caller, Thomas in Arkansas, going back to talk about UFO-related topics. In regard to the first book we discussed tonight, UFO Hunters Book 2. Hi, Thomas. You're on with Bill Birnes.
Hey, good morning, George. Good morning, Bill. How are y'all this morning?
Hi.
I'm doing good.
I had a comment, just a quick comment about the military. Once I joined the military, I didn't really know what to expect. And I can remember one class in particular when we were trained specifically on how to deal with UFO sightings and then UFO landings and how to deal specifically with extraterrestrials and UFO landings. Later on, I became a police officer, and I'm still a police officer currently, and I have been called to one particular UFO sighting, which was probably one of the stranger things that I have had to deal with, which was basically like a huge ball of shaped mercury in the sky. But you had talked about the units that come out with the military, and I just wanted to comment to that to say that it's there, and everyone down to the smallest private is trained on how to deal specifically with UFO landings, extraterrestrial issues. All those things are true. There's no doubt they teach classes on it when you enter the military. Wow,
and Thomas, go ahead, elaborate. I mean, who's running the show on that?
Okay, when you enter the military, whether that be the Army, the Marines, etc., you have classes. One class will teach you how to perform certain duties with your rifle, whether it be shoot it, clean it, whatever. You have a class on land navigation where you use compasses and maps. Then you have a particular class on how to deal with UFO and extraterrestrial issues. The basics, it's pretty simple. You go through a pre-stepped process where when and if something lands, you are called out to it, or if you happen to be standing guard in a certain area, your first thing is to cordon. So you put on a cordon, and that's what the military basically calls, like you'd wrap a police line around it. No one in, no one out. Extraterrestrials don't come out. Humans don't go in. No one in or out, period. if you have to use deadly force, then that's what you have to use, because no one comes in or out, period. Then your second step is to call to hire to make sure that, your hire is coming. Whoever is in charge of that particular place or that particular unit, they come out. And then if extraterrestrial contact is made, then if they come out of a ship or something like that, and then you have to call up the hire. But the only contact that you are allowed to make, unless you are a higher rank, is to tell the extraterrestrial, hopefully in some way they can understand you. You tell them that you have called to hire and your superior will be there shortly to talk about anything. But they do not leave and no one else enters. So first thing is to cordon, then you call the hire, give them a report of what's going on, and then if contact is made with the extraterrestrial, then, like I say, you tell them in whatever way you can that hire is on the way and your leadership will be there.
So Thomas, let me ask you, are you told not to talk about this?
Absolutely. If you are in higher command, that will be dictated as needed at the time. We'll just take, for instance, the Roswell situation, or you could do Kecksburg or any of the others. Thing lands, and it's pretty textbook the way the military deals with it. There's a cordon set up, just like the class says, no one in or out. That's pretty textbook. That's what you hear in all the reports from civilians that may be in the area. The military won't let you in, and nobody's coming out, definitely. And then once they call the hire comes, and all of those, whoever the superior command is at the time, and they could come from different military factions. It just depends. It could be civilian.
I'll tell you what, Thomas, we don't have enough time to go into a lot of detail. Why don't you send me an email, because I'd like to also hear the story about this ball of mercury in the sky. Give an email address to G. Lee, our call screener, and we'll be in touch. I'll pass it along to Bill. I think he might have some questions for you as well. Thanks for calling. Try to get one more quick call in east of the Rockies. Barry in South Carolina. Hi, Barry. You're on with Bill Birnes.
Hello there, George. I was just about to drift off to sleep when the show came on, and the next thing I knew, you were slamming into my radio like a nanoparticle of unobtainium.
We got a minute left. Barry, thanks.
Real quick. Oh, I'm so disappointed and so sad to hear Mickey Rooney is one of my all-time favorite comedians and actors. And I had heard a few rumors, but I didn't know it was quite as bad as it was. And so anyway, I'll just comment on that and tell you and feel that great show tonight, George. And please keep up the good work.
Thank you, Barry, for that call. And I think, Bill, what Barry touched on is how I reacted to it, too. It's the story you tell in this book, The Life and Times of Mickey Rooney. It's sad. It's sad on so many levels.
People shouldn't have to be that forlorn, that desperate, that destitute at the end of their lives, not especially when they've done so much. But that's what happened, and he was his own worst enemy, but he was the textbook case of somebody who was never raised by parents.
Bill, I want to thank you for coming on to talk about it. I recommend both of these books. They're great. They're great reads. UFO Hunters Book 2 and The Life and Times of Mickey Rooney. Always a pleasure to speak with you. I don't know. I'd hate to have your coffee, Bill, because you can't possibly sleep as much as you crank out.
I do work 24/7. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure, George. Have a wonderful rest of the evening.
Hope you'll come back when that next book comes out. Thanks again.
I will
Thanks
send
also
you a copy as soon as I.
All right. Thanks also to my earlier guest, John Greenwald of the Black Vault, and to my colleagues there at Coast to Coast, Jeff DeRay, Juan Velasquez, Nathan Staten, G. Lee, Dan Galani, our webmaster, Lex Lonehood, Chris Boros, and I'll be back next month, everyone. Good night.